My name is Andrew, and if someone had told me a few years ago that the biggest heartbreak of my life would come not from a dramatic, obvious betrayal but from a slow, creeping sense of unease that turned out to be far more destructive than any single moment of infidelity, I would have laughed and told them they were being too cynical because I used to believe that love, once built on a solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect, was strong enough to weather almost anything. I met Sophie at a coffee shop near the University of Vermont campus, back when both of us were juggling part-time jobs and heavy class loads. And something about the way she tapped her pen against her coffee cup while studying made me smile even before we exchanged a single word. Our connection grew over time, slow and steady like roots digging into the earth, and by the time graduation rolled around it felt as natural to plan a future together as it did to breathe. So we packed up our tiny apartment filled with mismatched furniture and second-hand kitchenware and moved to a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, Oregon, where we dreamed of building a life that would feel like ours in every messy, beautiful way. Life wasn't glamorous. We worked long hours, often barely saw each other during the week, and spent weekends tackling grocery lists and laundry piles, but it was ours. And I loved it in a way that made the sacrifices feel small compared to the warmth of coming home to someone who knew all your quirks and loved you anyway. But over time, something started to shift in small, almost invisible ways, like how Sophie started spending more time texting people I didn't know from her new office job, or how she seemed more distracted during dinners, laughing at jokes she didn't share with me or sighing heavily at questions she once would have answered without hesitation. I brushed it off at first because everyone gets busy, life gets overwhelming, and relationships naturally go through phases where the spark dims before it reignites stronger. Or so I told myself as I made excuses for every moment that didn't feel quite right but wasn't bad enough to confront. One night she mentioned a coworker named Eric, someone she described as harmless and funny in a weird way. And the way she talked about him was casual enough that I didn't think twice until I realized she brought him up more often than anyone else from her job, slipping his name into stories that didn't really need it and laughing at memories I hadn't been part of. Still, I trusted her because that's what you do when you love someone and when you believe that the foundation you built together is strong enough to withstand whatever external storms life throws your way. But deep down, a small voice kept whispering that something wasn't adding up, that there were pieces missing from the puzzle of our life that used to fit together so easily, and no matter how hard I tried to silence it, the feeling only grew stronger with every passing week. I started noticing other changes too, like how Sophie began guarding her phone more closely, leaving it face down on the table when we were together, or stepping into another room to answer texts that she once would have responded to right in front of me, and how she suddenly had new plans that didn't include me, like after-work happy hours and weekend team-building retreats that she insisted were mandatory but that somehow never seemed to include spouses or partners. I didn't want to be the guy who snooped through someone's phone or questioned every outing because that's not who I was and that's not the kind of relationship I ever wanted to have, but the doubt gnawed at me until it became impossible to ignore. So one night when she fell asleep early on the couch after a few too many glasses of wine, I did something I never thought I'd do, and I picked up her phone not to invade her privacy, but to find some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. What I found instead shattered every piece of the trust one had so carefully built over the years, because buried among work emails and group chats was a long thread of messages between her and Eric, messages that didn't leave much to the imagination about how close they had become and how deeply she had been leaning on him emotionally in ways she no longer leaned on me. They weren't overtly romantic yet, but they didn't have to be, because anyone with half a heart could see that emotional infidelity had already taken root, and that it was only a matter of time before it grew into something physical if it hadn't already. I sat there with her phone in my hands, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath me, and the worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, it was the realization that I had seen this coming for months and had gaslight myself into believing that love alone would be enough to stop it. I didn't confront her that night because I didn't know how to say what needed to be said without breaking down into 1,000 pieces, and I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing just how much she had broken me, so instead I placed her phone back where I found it and went to bed staring at the ceiling until sunrise, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do now. In the days that followed, I pulled away without fully realizing it, showing up later from work, lingering in my car before going inside, finding excuses to be busy on weekends. And it didn't take long for Sophie to notice, because she wasn't stupid, and guilt has a way of making people hypersensitive to the distance they themselves have created. She asked me one evening over dinner if something was wrong, and I almost laughed, because how do you explain to someone that you're grieving a relationship that they're still pretending is alive and well and thriving? I told her I was just stressed with work, and she nodded, pretending to believe me because it was easier than facing the truth, and for a little while we lived in that uncomfortable limbo, pretending that if we didn't name the problem, maybe it would go away on its own. But the truth is that problems don't disappear just because you refuse to look at them. They grow in the dark like weeds, choking out whatever good is left. And by the time I finally found the courage to confront her, there wasn't much left between us except resentment and unspoken accusations hanging in the air like a thick fog we couldn't see our way through. I chose a Friday evening when I knew we'd have the whole weekend without work as an excuse to avoid distractions or easy exits, and I sat her down in the living room where we once curled up together, binge-watching shows and dreaming about future vacations, and I told her, point blank, that I knew about the messages and that I deserved the truth straight from her mouth, not filtered through half-lies or watered down to spare my feelings. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at the floor like a child caught with their hand in the cookie jar. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers, but the words were clear enough. She said she was sorry, she never meant for it to go that far. She didn't know how to stop once it started. She didn't want to hurt me, but she needed something she couldn't find with me anymore. I asked her what that something was, and she couldn't answer, or maybe she just wouldn't, because admitting it out loud would have made it real and irreversible, but I already knew the truth deep down, and hearing it spoken wouldn't have made it hurt any less. She tried to frame it as a mistake, as a lapse in judgment, as something that could be forgiven and repaired if we both worked hard enough. And maybe once upon a time I would have believed that. Maybe I would have begged her to stay and promised to be better and tried to fix something that wasn't mine to fix, but not this time, because somewhere along the way between finding those messages and sitting on that couch, I realized that love without trust isn't love at all. It's a slow death of everything good you once believed about another person. I told her I couldn't do it, that I couldn't pretend everything was okay just because she was sorry now that she got caught, and that while I didn't hate her, I couldn't stay with someone who saw me as a backup plan instead of a partner. She cried, and I cried too, but not for the same reasons, because I think she was mourning the version of herself she had destroyed while I was mourning the life I thought we were building, the future that now would only ever exist in the rearview mirror of what could have been. After that night, everything moved quickly, not because we wanted it to, but because once the truth is out, you can't pretend. It doesn't change everything, and the space between us that used to be filled with shared routines and private jokes was now a gaping wound we both tiptoed around, trying not to make it worse, even though we both knew it was already fatal. We agreed she would move out first since her job made it easier to find a short-term place, and I would keep the apartment for the remainder of the lease, but even those logistics felt cold and clinical, like dividing up assets after a business merger gone bad, and it hurt more than I thought it would to see her packing up her things quietly, avoiding eye contact as she placed framed photos into boxes and folded sweaters I once bought her for Christmas without so much as a word between us. I tried to stay out of the way, sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out at a street that looked exactly the same as it had when we first moved in together, even though everything inside me felt like it had shifted off its axis. She left on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, fittingly enough, since everything about that day felt gray and heavy, and I watched from the window as she loaded the last of her things into the back seat of her car, pausing for a second before getting in, as if debating whether to come back up and say one final goodbye, but in the end she didn't. And I'm glad, because there are some endings that don't need words, they just need to happen so you can finally start breathing again. The first night alone in the apartment was worse than I expected, not because I missed her exactly, but because every corner of the place felt haunted by memories we built together, memories that now felt cheap and fragile, like glass figurines knocked off a shelf by careless hands. I slept on the couch because the bed felt too big, too empty, too loud with absence, and I left the TV on all night, not watching anything in particular, just needing the background noise to drown out the questions and regrets swirling around in my head. In the mornings, I went through the motions: shower, breakfast, work, like a robot programmed to function without feeling, and it wasn't until I found myself crying over an old grocery list she had scribbled on the back of a receipt that I realized grief doesn't always announce itself with a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes it sneaks up on you in the quiet, ordinary moments and leaves you gasping for air when you least expect it. Friends tried to pull me out of it with invitations to happy hours and game nights and weekend trips, and while I appreciated their efforts, I mostly declined because the thought of making small talk while pretending my heart wasn't cracked wide open felt exhausting and fake. And I didn't want to be the guy who showed up to every gathering with a sadness so thick you could see it before I even said a word. Instead, I threw myself into work, staying late whenever possible, volunteering for projects that didn't even interest me because it was easier to drown in tasks than sit alone with my own thoughts. And even though I told myself I was coping, I knew deep down that Burying the pain wasn't the same thing as healing it, and sooner or later all those unspoken feelings would surface whether I was ready for them or not. It wasn't until a Saturday afternoon when I found myself cleaning out the closet and stumbled across a shoebox filled with old birthday cards, movie ticket stubs, and Polaroid photos that I finally broke the spell I had been under, because holding those relics of a happier time felt like holding someone else's life, a life that no longer belonged to me. And in that moment, I realized I had two choices. I could keep clinging to the ghost of what we used to be, or I could finally let it go and make room for whatever came next, even if I had no idea what that would look like. So I gathered everything that reminded me of her, not out of anger or spite, but out of necessity, and I put it all in a box which I sealed with thick layers of tape and carried down to the basement storage unit where it could gather dust out of sight and out of mind. And when I came back upstairs, the apartment felt lighter, somehow like I had cracked a window and let a stale room breathe for the first time in months. I started making small changes after that, nothing drastic at first, just swapping out the old throw pillows she picked for ones I actually liked, buying new coffee mugs, because every morning cup shouldn't remind me of conversations that ended in betrayal, and opening the blinds wider to let more sunlight in, because hiding in the dark wasn't doing me any favors. Slowly, the apartment stopped feeling like a shrine to what was lost and started becoming something new, something that felt like mine, and that subtle shift gave me more hope than any pep talk or self-help book ever could. I reconnected with people I had distanced myself from during the relationship, not because Sophie asked me to, but because it's easy to get so wrapped up in a relationship that you forget to nurture the friendships that sustain you in ways romance never can. And sitting around a bonfire with old friends laughing until my stomach hurt reminded me that happiness didn't have to be complicated or earned. It could simply exist. Some nights were still hard, of course, and there were times when loneliness wrapped around me like a second skin, and the temptation to text her just to feel something familiar flickered across my mind, but I resisted, not because I didn't miss what we had, but because I finally understood that missing someone doesn't mean you should invite them back into your life if they're the reason you had to rebuild in the first place. As more time passed, I found myself thinking about Sophie less, not because I had erased her from my memory, but because my mind was finally making space for new thoughts, new routines, new possibilities. And even though healing didn't happen overnight, it happened steadily and quietly, like a tree growing roots deep beneath the surface, long before anyone sees the first green shoot breaking through the soil. I took up running again, something I hadn't done seriously since college, and there was something freeing about pounding the pavement with music blasting in my ears, feeling the burn in my lungs and legs, and knowing that every step was a small rebellion against the version of me that once thought he couldn't survive without her. I ran when I was sad, I ran when I was angry, I ran when I didn't know what else to do, and somewhere along the way the run stopped feeling like escape routes and started feeling like declarations of resilience, reminders that even after everything I was still here, still moving, still capable of building a life worth living. I also started journaling again, not the kind of forced gratitude list you make because someone on the internet said you should, but real, honest, messy entries about the good, the bad, and everything in between. And looking back at those pages, I could actually see the slow shift from heartbreak to hope mapped out in ink and vulnerability. There was one night after a particularly long run when I stood in my kitchen, sweaty and exhausted, drinking water straight from the tap, and I realized with a kind of quiet certainty that I didn't love her anymore, not the real her, not the person who chose someone else over me, not the memory I had been clinging to like a security blanket made of broken promises. That realization didn't come with fireworks or tears. It was just a simple, calm acceptance, like finally setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for too long and feeling lighter, not because the weight changed, but because you finally decided you didn't have to hold it anymore. I started noticing the little things again, the way the sunset looked when it hit the windows just right, the satisfaction of finishing a project at work, the simple pleasure of having an entire bed to myself and not needing to share the blankets, and those tiny victories added up day by day until one morning I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about her at all the day before, and that small piece of freedom tasted sweeter than any apology she could have ever offered. It was around this time that I started letting new people into my life, not in a desperate attempt to replace what was lost, but because I had finally cleared enough emotional space to be open to something new without dragging the weight of old wounds into every conversation. And I met people through friends, through work, through chance encounters that reminded me the world is full of good souls if you're willing to look up from your own heartbreak long enough to see them. I wasn't looking for love, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if I wanted it anytime soon, but one evening while attending a small art show downtown hosted by a friend of a friend, I struck up a conversation with someone named Taylor who had this laugh that made everyone around her smile without even realizing they were doing it, and somehow we ended up talking for hours about everything from favorite books to childhood dreams without a single awkward silence. It felt different, not forced or rushed or heavy with expectation, just two people existing in the same moment without trying to impress or fix each other. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about who she reminded me of or comparing her to anyone from my past. I was just present, enjoying the simple gift of connection without baggage trailing behind every word. We exchanged numbers, but I didn't obsess over when she would text or what it meant if she didn't, because healing had taught me that healthy connections don't need to be chased or overanalyzed. They either grow naturally or they don't, and either outcome is okay. I kept running, I kept writing, I kept rebuilding, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, including myself, but because the life I was creating finally felt like it was mine, not a patchwork of compromises made to fit someone else's dreams. There were still moments of loneliness, because healing isn't a straight line, and there were still nights when the old sadness crept in like fog rolling over a familiar landscape, but those moments became less scary over time because I knew they were temporary and they didn't define me anymore. I started feeling proud of the person I was becoming, not in some loud, flashy way, but in the quiet pride that comes from knowing you faced the worst parts of yourself and your situation without letting it turn you bitter or closed off, and that kind of pride runs deeper than any validation you can get from outside sources. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had stopped surviving and started living again, and that realization didn't come with fanfare or some dramatic life event. It just arrived quietly on an ordinary Tuesday morning as I drank my coffee and smiled at nothing in particular, because sometimes peace is just that simple. Over the next few months, I continued to build a life that felt good even on the hard days, because I stopped measuring my progress by how little I thought about the past and started measuring it by how often I felt genuinely excited about the future, no matter how small or uncertain those excitements were. And that shift in focus changed everything in ways I never could have predicted back when the pain was still fresh and heavy. Taylor and I stayed in touch, meeting up occasionally for coffee or bookstore wanderings, and while there was definitely a spark, I didn't try to rush it into anything more, because for the first time I understood that real connections deserve the patience to grow at their own pace without being forced to fill a void left behind by someone else's mistakes. I also started traveling again, nothing extravagant, just weekend road trips to nearby towns or spontaneous hikes through trails I had never explored, and with every new place I visited, I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of the world that had once felt closed off to me when I was too wrapped up in my own grief to notice anything beyond it. I learned to appreciate solitude in a way I never had before, recognizing that being alone doesn't mean being lonely, and that some of the best conversations you'll ever have are the ones you have with yourself while driving down an empty highway or sitting quietly beside a river. I still thought about Sophie from time to time, not with anger or longing, but with a kind of detached gratitude, because even though her betrayal hurt me deeply, it also forced me to confront parts of myself that needed healing, parts that might have stayed buried forever if life had continued on its easy, familiar path. I realized that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who inadvertently push us toward the growth we never would have chosen for ourselves, and while that doesn't excuse their actions, it does allow us to reclaim our own narratives instead of staying stuck in chapters that no longer serve us. One evening, while watching the sunset from a bluff overlooking the coast, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, the kind that doesn't come from anything external, but from the simple fact that for the first time in years I wasn't wishing for a different past or worrying about an uncertain future. I was just existing in the moment, and it was enough. That feeling stayed with me long after the sun dipped below the horizon, and I made a silent promise to myself to keep choosing that kind of peace every day, even when it wasn't easy, because if there's one thing I learned from losing everything I thought I wanted, it's that happiness isn't something you stumble upon by accident. It's something you build intentionally, brick by brick, moment by moment, choice by choice. Looking back now, I can honestly say that I wouldn't change anything about what happened, even though it broke my heart at the time, because every painful step of that journey shaped me into someone who understands the value of trust, the necessity of self-respect, and the importance of listening to the quiet voice inside that tells you when something isn't right, even if you don't want to believe it. I learned that healing isn't about pretending you were never hurt or erasing the memories that once brought you joy, but about integrating those experiences into the fabric of who you are and choosing to move forward without letting bitterness take root in your heart. I learned that forgiveness isn't something you do for the person who wronged you, it's something you do for yourself, to free your spirit from the chains of resentment and regret, and to make room for new beginnings that aren't colored by the shadows of old wounds. Most of all, I learned that you can lose someone you thought you couldn't live without and not only survive but thrive, because your worth isn't tied to anyone else's ability to see it or treat it properly. It's inherent and unshakable, and yours alone to protect. Taylor and I eventually grew into something beautiful, not rushed or perfect, but real and rooted in the kind of mutual respect and honest communication I once thought were just fairy tales made up to sell romance novels and movie tickets. And whether it lasts a season or a lifetime, I know I'll be okay because my happiness is no longer dependent on external circumstances or other people's choices. If you're listening to this and you're in the thick of heartbreak, wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, let me tell you from the other side that you will not, because someone else will come along and fix you, but because you will find the strength to fix yourself, and in doing so you'll discover a kind of peace that no one can ever take away from you. You'll laugh again without forcing it, you'll trust again, without flinching, you'll dream again without fear, and one day you'll wake up and realize that the worst thing that ever happened to you was also the catalyst for the best version of yourself you've ever known. And when that day comes, you'll be grateful not for the betrayal or the pain, but for the way you rose from it stronger, wiser, and more beautifully yourself than you ever thought possible.